Eric's.
Omar.
Mm-hmm. We're gonna work on that synchronicity. It was so close. Okay, I sense it. The Erics have multiplied. I found out, Helms, an astonishing fact in the last episode. I don't know if you had a chance to listen to it.
I've definitely listened to it. I've listened to it multiple times. And, I mean, is it a fact or is it just theory at this point?
Yeah. It's something. It's a statement. I will say that there was a shocking truth that Trexler dropped on me. So I went over, let's call it the Trexler birth theory, as it's known in the community. And that is that he was born and grown in a vat. And his actual biological age is 5 years old. We needed someone that had no collateral negative associations with it because we're both shock jocks, myself and Helms. So grew him in a vat. He's pristine, super knowledgeable, highly effective, as we're going to read the comments, science communicators. And then I said, hey, because someone said, all we need now is a third Eric, right, for the trifecta, Buddha, Omar. I said, I agree. And Trexler said, I'm not even kidding you, Omar. I know so many Erics in the exercise science field. And I'm just wondering, how many Erics are there out there?
It's a hard question to answer. Yeah. I don't think anyone's ever quantified that.
It's not a typical name. It's not common at all.
You know, names go through generational popularities.
True.
You know, like I think there's actually some discussion of that because you know how we associate certain names with like old people. Like there's no one who's 14 named Gertrude, right? Yeah. And it has more to do with there was a time 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 70 years ago where that was a dope name, you know? Yeah. And all the young kids were naming their kids Gertrude. And then times change and here we are and they're all cute biddies, you know? So.
And I think what Helms is getting at is that he was named Eric when it was popular and then many, many years passed, it fell out of favor, it came back around, and then I was born and it was already back in style.
Got it. So
I'm the OG is what I'm saying. I'm the OE, I guess. So
the original Eric. Well, now that we have both of you, the holy trifecta is here. I actually want to welcome Helms back on to Iron Culture. You've been gone for 2 weeks competing, doing the damn thing. And yes, people say I'm just full of compliments for Helms. And it's true, but I mean it genuinely. The package that you brought on stage was sensational. For the competitions, he was out in North America doing the damn thing, posing, flexing, dancing, and what a sight to behold. So we're glad to have you back now. You're back home. You're ready to rock. What? just do some housekeeping.
Those who are watching the video, I am ready to rock, and I am turning off AC so that you can hear me better as I rock, making sure that there's no audio issues here at AUT while I'm probably cooking our servers. And earlier, as you can tell from the headset I'm wearing, because my headset, I managed to leave at home, and I randomly stole this from someone else's desk in the offices. I am definitely doing air traffic controlling at the same time. So my plane landed safely, and it was warm because the AC was off. But the good news is that I did come home as well as the New Zealand national champion in bodybuilding for the WNBF.
Oh, bro.
And placed second and then third in the next two shows I did in very competitive middleweight lineups, and also took my first Masters win. Which was fun. And no, I had a really, really cool experience. I did 3 back-to-back shows, which is a first for me. And I think the average bodybuilder would feel like they wanted to like throw up in their mouth or just start sweating if they kind of used your typical approach to peaking. But it really just required me restructure my refeed timing. And judicious use of melatonin, since 2 of those were in the States, and the first one was here in New Zealand. So there was a 12-hour flight, and then Jeff and I drove up the next weekend to Washington from California. So it was a really cool experience, and just have to say there's a lot of really good people in the sport. Big shout out to Simon and Stephanie Collins, who are the WNBF New Zealand Pres and Vice Pres who promote the show. It's the second year it's been on. First year I was a judge. This year I was on stage. And then big shout out as well to Francisco Insunza, who runs the Battle of the Bay, which has over the last few years become one of the biggest and best and most competitive California drug-free shows. And that's in Fremont, which is cool because that's where Jeff grew up. And he was doing the Mr. Fremont show that was hosted by Ed Corney back in the 90s, just to kind of give you an idea of the history that he has with that place. So he was really enjoyed watching me compete in Battle of the Bay. And then the next week, it was like a bodybuilding training camp as Jeff and I just honed in. His family was on vacation in Cancun, and we were doing posing practice, cardio twice a day, and training, and calculating our macros for our peak. And then we did a 2-day drive up from where he lives in Stockton. We did a 6-hour drive up to Grants Pass, stayed there, and another 7-hour drive the next day to get to Arlington, which is just kind of north of Seattle. It's a Seattle suburb, I guess you could say. And we competed in a really awesome show, the WNBF Washington State, which has recently taken over by WNBF pro and now promoter Aaron Orton from Kevin James. And he was the promoter all the way back to when I first did that show. And Jeff won his pro card in 2009. So I was in the overall of the Washington State. I won the light heavyweight division. Jeff won the middles, and then Jeff went on to beat me, and more importantly, beat Luke Ellis by 1 point, the heavyweight winner. Like, I wasn't really the threat in that overall to get his pro card. So he was going back to do his first pro show in qualifying for Worlds, and I was going back to try to take a shot at the title. So yeah, I went up against some very, very, very competitive individuals, and some very close decisions. And yeah, I'm still bringing the heat, getting leaner and leaner, and now I'm just about a week out, 8 days out from WNBF Australia, and I'm looking small with clothes on and good with clothes off. And I'm just telling you, I recently, last week, I had one of my colleagues ask me, "But are you well?" And I'm like, "I am ready. I know it." She was like, "Just want to make sure you're healthy," because she's looking at my face. And I'm like, "Oh yeah, it's on." So I'm starting to have that whole chemotherapy look. So that means we're ready to rock in natural bodybuilding.
Trexler, what were you laughing at?
I wasn't laughing. I was smiling and effectively stifling my laugh. I haven't felt that way since I was a child. When you were in class, you wanted to giggle, but you had to hold it in. I just so badly wanted to make a Kevin James actor joke. And I didn't feel appropriate to kind of like dive in with that and to completely derail your synopsis that everyone's on the edge of their seat. Everyone wants to hear how you did. The joke would have been a low value joke. But then I felt a lot of shame for wanting to make a Kevin James joke. And then I started laughing at my own shame. And then I saw Omar smiling, and then it created a cycle that was not good.
Omar, it seems like Trex is still figuring out how we roll here at Iron Culture, where jokes that are unrelated to topics that completely derail it and create a tangent are actually what Iron Culture is, not the topic that we tangented away from. Yeah. And the goal is basically for anyone who gets annoyed with that to stop consuming our content because they're not our people,
But leave a good review on your way out if you don't mind.
Yeah. Please do. Yeah, hit smash that like button as you dislike it.
So a few things there, Trex. You can giggle anytime you want because we're just a gaggle of guys having a good time. And I will say I'm actually surprised because this might be the first current meme reference, myself and Helms. It's some really esoteric shit that we'll both reference and we'll get. It's like, oh shit, did you see that film? We'll talk like Event Horizon. Yes, it is a semi-popular film. Or Helms, what's the other one that we both watched? Slightly different ages, but both scarred from Carnosaurus. What is it?
Carnosaur.
Thank you. So like references, everyone's like, just stop talking about it. But Trex is amazing because you actually made a contemporary meme where the Kevin James thing,
all over.
It's all like you're on point. We're behind the times, or someone would say ahead of the curve, behind the times, however you interpret it. But I thought you were laughing because for Helms, like you've done the damn thing. In the last episode, you're actually talking a little bit how your coworkers, I believe, asked you, or maybe those also in your space when you were dieting a little bit, like, are you okay? And like you're reaching that final destination. When people start asking those questions, like he's not going to make it. So I thought that's maybe what you're laughing at, but yeah.
Yeah, and I over dieted pretty hard that year. It was a very egregious instance of over dieting. And so, yeah, I was not looking well to the extent that like people didn't even ask me. They were asking around about me because they didn't want to be in that conversation.
Yep.
You know what I mean? It was that dire. But yeah, I mean, my face in terms of leanness and just my general affect, people are like, yeah, I don't want to bring it up.
The hoodies, as you said, Helms.
I think that the jaundice look also contributed. So like depending on the type of color you get.
Oh
so
yeah.
I've done 3 shows in a row, so I have a little bit of a more brown, a little more red, and then a little more yellow base tan that is like retained from each one. So I currently look like I don't know if people can tell, but just a little slightly off orange. So I look like someone who's like dialysis. Really, I just don't feel like it. I'm good, you know. So I've got the jaundice look. But I will say to my credit, the conversation was like, "Hey, congratulations! I saw some pictures. You look great." Blah blah blah. And then they looked at me and like, "But you're well, right?" Like it was. They were acknowledging that. And there was. I don't think I seemed fine, in terms of my interactions. So it was more of a, just shredded face, skinny look, and no matter what content I do right now, I guarantee to get a comment on like Helms' death march face. And then like the little emoji of the skull. Like I was like, oh, because we regularly post on the Mass Research Review Instagram now.
Mm-hmm.
And by regularly, I mean I sometimes forget, but I did not this most recent Wednesday. And I was like, oh, it'd be a cool mass blast from the past would be the Hubel study on individual different responses back done in 2005, nearly 600 participants. Let's see what people think of that. I bet they're going to be surprised. 0 to 250% gain in 8 weeks across individuals in 1RM. First comment, damn, Helms' face is looking thin. I was like, okay. Second comment, same thing. I'm like, all right, maybe I should have not had my face in this video and just done a voiceover because this is clearly distracting for the learners. So yeah, that's where we're at.
It was just the angle. I do want to say congratulations and welcome back. We were about to get to the topic, but I do want to read a few comments because we've imported what can only be described like Trex. What do you call them? Trex Nation, Trex Army. Like, what is there official terminology? Because you have Trex stands and they're flooding the comments. Like we had last episode 30. This episode we had 15 comments. What do we call them?
Yeah, so Trex Army is kind of the more aggressive group within Trex Nation. So Trex Nation is very large, but Trex Army is usually the folks that you find in the comments who are really going to bat for me.
Yeah, they're the fanatical ones. Yeah,
you need an army to defend the nation.
Yeah.
Correct.
I think everyone understands that.
Yeah. So I want to read just a few comments, and then we could get to the topic, which weirdly enough, Helms, the last 2 ones, they weren't about you, but they could have been. And this one, I feel, could be about me. And once again, the infamous results from that Texas Tech. But Trex, react to just a few of these quick. Punk and Lifting, like the name, left a comment. These 2 episodes have been fantastic. Trexler really is an excellent science communicator.
I was nervous when he started. I thought they were going to say, these 2 have been the best ever. And I would have said, hey, don't do that to Helms. Don't do that to my guy. Not live. Not on camera.
Not like this. Someone else said so. Helms, I know you listened to the episode, definitely, where we made a reference that we're coming for Joe Rogan, or as we affectionately call him here, Joe Rogaine. And so someone left a comment and just said, Joe Rogan, we're coming to get you.
We are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it says it all.
Yeah. And then someone else said, you'll surpass Rogan in no time. I mean, so currently we get like total downloads, like we said. So on the audio side, we're sitting between, it depends, I'd say like 20,000 to, if it's like a hot episode, maybe 40,000. Rogan, like who's to say? Spotify, they really don't release their numbers anymore. Sure, on YouTube, his episodes would get millions. It's hard to compare, but nonetheless, we're on the come up.
Yeah, different metrics, and basically the same, if not just maybe a hair's breadth behind him, I would say.
We could also play the long game and just hope that he stops at some point, and then we'll win by default. War of attrition.
Yeah, I think
Masters titles.
Yes,
Iron Culture Masters podcast champs. That's what we're going for.
I think with some of his diet territories, this is a possibility. But Two more real quick. Someone said, crisscross applesauce said, love this, exclamation. Very nice.
Yeah, appreciate that. Love them.
Yeah. And then Lindsay said, another fascinating episode. And then it is, like, I know we got to get to the topic. She said at the end, also, when I shuffle off this mortal coil, that is a iron culture reference right there, I will at least be gratified to know I've added Trexler to the iron culture lexicon.
Wow. Yeah, really building it a lot here. I mean, what episode are we on here?
So
we're deep.
Yeah, this would be 245 when it comes out.
245.
Yeah.
I mean, weaving in completely new backstories and narratives into this deep into the game. I mean, this is like a Game of Thrones. Like, we're on book 4, maybe. Yeah. There's still a lot to come.
Yeah, I mean, you've got quite the hill to climb. So this is the pace you need to maintain, because we're operating off of Hereditary, potato famines, Danny Lennon being a serial killer,
babies, bathwater.
Me throwing babies out with the bathwater, and not even that being a metaphor. We're talking about Airbnb murders. We're talking about
stuck together.
Yeah, stuck together. We're talking about, do I actually have a problem with impotence? There's a lot.
That was a short arc. Folks, that was a short arc. Okay.
Oh yeah, it was a short arc. Tell you what.
And then I defend Helms for a whole episode why I said there's a reason why he was referred to. Is that your disciplinarian stick, Eric?
Well, no, I just realized that there's also a light I can turn on with this stick. So I tell you what, this is what you got to watch on YouTube, folks. You're missing out.
Trexler, is fidgeting normal? And I've never seen Eric move around. Is he trying to like lose extra? What is going on here? Like, give me some commentary.
It's called ADHD.
No.
Yeah. This is behavioral. This isn't. This is not dieting physiology. It's not in my realm of expertise. But I am. What is with the stick? What is that, like
to defend yourself?
A standard thing in New Zealand to have things up high and you do it with a stick?
There's a very high ceiling here in this office, and the AC requires the stick to turn on and off. And then out of convenience, I thought, well, I don't want to stand up and go off camera again to turn on the light.
Yep. Yeah.
I can use that stick again. So it was just MacGyvering in the second situation, and it was the actual, you need to do it in the first situation.
Yeah. But that's like optimal use case. The way that AC is designed is that you are supposed to poke it with a very long pole.
Yeah. I think honestly, the intention is that because this is supposed to be a climate controlled facility, you're not supposed to touch that. And they put it above where you're supposed to be. So this is me fighting the man, us.
Wow.
Us as academics knowing that we're being ground down by the machine, saying, you know what, we have individual needs for heat comfort, and or not wanting to have ambient noise that Brandon has to edit out on my audio. So.
Speaking of that, I have some science to drop. I listened to a seminar today from someone who's studies aging, and they dropped a little nugget I wasn't aware of. Did you know that labs where they house mice for research studies are too cold for mice?
I did not know that.
Yeah, it's like it's a little bit colder than a mouse would normally be in their environment, and they're just like, well, should we put the mice in a normal physiological state for them, or should we just be more comfortable? And the entire world opted for, we'll just be more comfortable. So yeah,
is anyone surprised by that?
They're like perpetually under like a mild cold stress in essentially all research.
And it only gets worse for them. I mean, most research ends with
death,
and then they were sacrificed. So, I mean,
yeah. But no, it was fascinating because he was talking about certain lines of research where, like a drug was, shown to work time and time and time again in lab mice. And then there was a human trial and it was like catastrophically bad. Like there were very severe adverse effects. And then they tried it on wild mice and they had catastrophically bad adverse effects. And so he was kind of talking about the discrepancy of like, if we do so much control for lab mice, they don't even really generalize to normal mice anymore, let alone
that's a really interesting
humans
point.
In some cases. Yeah.
It makes you also think about, how we have the line of data that suggested the brown adipose tissue and beige adipose tissue, like those way different in animals versus versus humans. And that one of the ways you can induce conversion is by being in a cold environment. And you're like, hold on, is it because they're constantly in a cold environment that we're seeing this? That just popped in my head now.
I don't know. And part of that is methodological. So like I did a methods paper about identifying and quantifying brown adipose tissue, and humans have more of it than we used to think. So part of that was a misnomer or kind of a misconception just because of poor quantification methodology.
Okay.
But yeah, that could be something. But here's another fun fact. There was a study where they took just the bedding, like just the crap at the bottom of the cage from mice in a pet store, and they put it in the pen where they keep the laboratory mice, dead within 2 weeks.
Whoa.
Yeah. Crazy.
So they basically have unformed immune systems because they're kept in such a sanitized environment.
Yeah. And so like even a pet store mouse and their environment, they didn't even put a pet store mouse in the pen with them. They just took the bedding and put it in there, dead within 2 weeks.
And on that
folks.
cheery note, I will say I learned
This is science. I don't know what to
this
tell
is
you.
science.
You told me,
they wanted science.
Trex, come in here, be a scientist. I'm doing science right now. I don't know what you want from me.
Yeah,
Hey.
you're killing it. You're doing great. And I think it's just a good lesson in the reality of the biopsychosocial model.
Exactly.
I will say I learned on Iron Culture all about ablation and mice. Don't need to go into that. We are going to now officially get into the segment, the actual topic for this episode. I was counting on you, Helms, because the top comment, which is why I put on a shirt for this one, was that Omar's delts are looking huge. I can't focus on anything else. That was my side account. Then I boosted it, of course, because we are so back, baby. I was picturing, and again, this says more about me than the actual likelihood or reality of the situation. Helms coming in, doing a little posing sesh. Then we begin. And here we are, fully clothed. Everyone's disappointed, is what it is.
Well, I am a physique sports science researcher.
Thank you.
But I don't know yet that has gotten the level of respect here at AUT to where me coming in posing trunks is considered work attire. But I'm working on it. I'll tell you that much.
You're finding the man. You're finding the man first with the AC, #open science. And I will say, with that being said, Trex, we do have a ring the bell, Brandon. Spend the entirety of the rest of our 2023 budget, you heard it here first, on graphics, audio noises. It's a monster episode. We are talking about BMI today. This is definitely not about myself or what happened at Texas Tech, where I did break down when I was told the number. Trex, I'm not sure where you want to kick it off, but many people would assume they've heard the concept of BMI. They've also heard this number 30 being floated around, that if you're over this amount, that it's not good, in quotations. Again, I'm not sure what I personally measured, and it may have been around that number, and you're here to defend me. But let's do a deep dive into this, because this is actually very interesting.
Yeah, I wanted to do an episode about BMI because BMI has had an interesting trajectory in terms of how we have regarded it as a health-related metric. So going back to the 90s, it seemed like, I don't know, I was a child, but the impression I get from reading literature of the time was that it was pretty broadly embraced, and people said, okay, BMI is an indirect indicator of adiposity. BMI in the American population and many other affluent populations seems to be increasing. That seems to be occurring in tandem or in parallel with increases in heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, things of that nature. And so it seemed like everyone, for the most part, was pretty on board with this concept that BMI was used as a kind of population level indicator of adiposity and therefore chronic diseases that are driven in part by adiposity. But in recent years, BMI, it's not a good time to be BMI, Omar. It really isn't. There are a lot of articles kind of pushing back and in many cases making good points that are true about the shortcomings of BMI, right? So it's not hard to find an article these days, particularly in the lay media, the lay press, where folks will point out BMI was not created as a nuanced health metric by a physician or team of physicians. It was devised by, back in the day, if you were a scientist, it was wild. You could be like, yeah, I'm a biologist and I'm a botanist and I'm also an astronomer and I'm a statistician. You just throw everything in there. So this was a guy who did stuff with numbers and science. That's pretty much what he did. But he was not a medical professional. He was not a physician. He did not treat patients. So it was basically my understanding of the story, painting with a broad brush, is he was interested in kind of quantifying, kind of the population level norm of within this particular country or this particular region. What does a typical ratio of mass to height look like here? So mass in kilograms divided by height squared. Worked with he made some different attempts and said, okay, yeah, this meters divided by, kilograms divided by meters squared seems to work pretty well. And it looks like the averages are blank, right? And so a lot of folks say, well, hey, that doesn't really represent the whole world population. It's not a direct health metric by any means. It's just a ratio involving height and weight. Those are valid concerns or valid points. Another thing is BMI certainly doesn't tell the whole story about a person's health. Not at all. Another one that's extremely true and obvious is BMI doesn't really make any distinction between fat mass, fat-free mass, bone, muscle. It's just weight, period. So there are a lot of really good points, more technical points about shortcomings of BMI. And then there's also kind of practical or kind of like societal points about BMI. And so if you look into the literature on weight bias, it's really troubling when you dig into it. You'll look at studies that seem to provide pretty good evidence indicating that individuals who go and see a medical professional or a physician with an elevated BMI, in many cases receive poorer care. Sometimes their concerns about their health are not really being heard and listened to and addressed. And in some cases, physicians will kind of delay extremely necessary care because when they see someone with a high BMI, they say, well, lose weight and then we'll talk about getting your health in order. When in reality, someone might have an ailment that is treatable not through lifestyle intervention, and perhaps that ailment has nothing to do with their BMI, right? But doctors kind of say, well, go sort that out and come back to me. Certainly not all doctors, certainly not most doctors, but too many, okay? So for all of these different reasons, people have pushed back and said, BMI is basically useless. What are we supposed to do with this anyway? It's not actually fat mass, and there's all these flaws with the science. It wasn't devised in a way that is empirical in nature as it pertains to health outcomes, and it's being misused left, right, and center all over the place, right? And so now we find BMI at the center of this debate where some people still cling to it as a extremely important health metric, and other people say that number means nothing to me. And so I wrote an article in the Mass Research Review relatively recently, couple months ago. And in that article, I did not defend BMI. I did not critique BMI. I just tried to look at, what are we seeing in the research? What does BMI do for us? What does BMI not do for us? And I really centered it around a brand new article, brand new at the time, that was looking at the concept of metabolically healthy obesity. Now, Omar, are you familiar with that term?
It's me. Yes, go on.
Yeah, it's exactly what it sounds like. Metabolically healthy obesity. The idea is, hey, you got a BMI over 30, but there have been some papers that have gotten a lot of attention over the last decade or two where folks will say, hey, we found these individuals, they have BMIs over 30, but metabolically, it looks like they're in great shape. We look at their blood lipids, we look at their blood pressure, we look at all these different indices of, metabolic syndrome. These folks seem to have good glycemic control, good blood lipids. They don't seem to be showing any of those more physiologically rooted indicators of long-term chronic disease risk. And so that opened up the door where a lot of folks were saying, okay, well, I have a BMI above 30, but I know that some folks are metabolically healthy with obesity. maybe I'm one of them. And that's even if we take BMI seriously as an indirect indicator of health status. So there's been a lot of nuance that's kind of been entering the conversation with BMI, and I wanted to get to the bottom of it. And so this new paper, it was by Marcus and colleagues. What they were doing was a cross-sectional study where they were looking at the prevalence of metabolically healthy obesity, and they were looking at BMI in these individuals. They had over 19,000 individuals in the sample. It was a huge cross-sectional effort. BMIs ranging from underweight or 18.5 in the sample all the way up to 46. So 18.5 is right at the cutoff where underweight begins, below that. So all the way up to 46. So a big range of folks, 19,000. And they were looking at, like I said, their BMI and then various components of metabolic syndrome. So metabolic syndrome is one of those things, you've probably heard about it by name, and oftentimes people don't dig into exactly, what goes into that. So when we talk about metabolic syndrome, we're talking about elevated triglycerides in the blood. We're talking about low HDL cholesterol, elevated plasma glucose, fasting plasma glucose, high blood pressure, and then we're also looking at increased waist circumference. So those are the 5 components of metabolic syndrome, and there's different ways to look at it. I think normally, what is it, Helms? Is it 3 elements would have you classified as someone with metabolic syndrome? Is that right?
I think so, but I'm honestly not 100% sure if I was to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If memory serves, I believe if you have 3 of the 5, 3 or more, you would be categorized as having metabolic syndrome. But you could also, if you wanted to, look at how many components of metabolic syndrome do you have, right? So it's probably better to have 3 instead of 5, right? So it's not so simple as just kind of giving a cutoff. It's, you could look at, do you have 0 or 1 or 2 all the way up? And so they looked at it both ways in this study. But painting, or kind of summarizing very broadly, what they found in this study was that there were plenty of people in the normal BMI category. I don't really like that term. I don't think people don't like it, and I agree with them. Because if you're not in the normal category, then you're not normal by the way the words work there. So the normal BMI category or the kind of healthy category that they use, which is also a misnomer, it's 18.5 to 25. Okay, so within that range, they found plenty of folks who actually did have some components of metabolic syndrome. They also found plenty of people in the obese BMI category, over 30, who had 0 components of metabolic syndrome. So there were relatively lean folks who had these things, these components, and there are people with BMIs over 30 who did not have any of them. And so that reinforces a very common argument that folks make, which is true, which is that you cannot look at me right now and, if I'm in that range somewhere of 18.5 to 31, you're not able to look at my BMI and tell me today what my health status is. You're just not. I mean, you might be able to make an educated guess, based on the typical ranges that we see. Someone who has a BMI of 31, there's a higher likelihood that they have some components of metabolic syndrome when we look at groups of people. But for one individual, you can't be certain just because their BMI is 19 or their BMI is 31 that you can just predict, with accuracy the number of metabolic syndrome components that single individual has. So that one, you have to give a little bit of credit to the folks who have been making that point and saying, hey, don't judge me as an individual purely based on what my BMI is. If we're talking about, within that range of maybe 18.5 to low 30s, right? However, the prevalence of metabolic syndrome components in this sample increased linearly with BMI. So that is to be expected. So as BMI went up, it was more likely that you had components of metabolic syndrome and had more components of metabolic syndrome. And then one of the things that they found that I think is really interesting, so you might have noticed that as I was presenting those ranges, I was very deliberate with the way that I framed them. I said, you can't necessarily tell within a range of if someone's, a BMI of 19 or a BMI of 31, if they're likely to have metabolic syndrome or if they're likely to have one or two metabolic components. But I did mention those specific ranges because, in this study, they did find that as BMI went up from the low 30s into, the high 30s, there was a very different prevalence of having metabolic syndrome components. So the prevalence of metabolically healthy obesity, 7.5% in the whole sample. So that's just looking at, when you include everybody, how many folks with a BMI above 30 had metabolically healthy obesity or fell within that category. But when you look at the prevalence of metabolically healthy obesity in folks with BMIs over 36, that prevalence dropped from 7.5% to 1%. And then, when you look at other data in the field, in the literature here, when you start looking at ranges of BMI well above, 35, 36, up into the 40s and beyond, you start to see that the prevalence or the likelihood of metabolically healthy obesity starts to get very, very, very low, well below 1% in terms of prevalence. And another thing that's really fascinating about that is, this study wasn't able to look at this particular topic because this is a cross-sectional study. But when you look at other research in this area, metabolically healthy obesity, you could make a very good argument that it, in many cases, is a fairly transient state. And what I mean by that is a lot of folks who have, at one point in time, they have metabolically healthy obesity. In longitudinal studies where they check back in with them, several years down the road, they often see that a high percentage of folks who had metabolically healthy obesity at the first time point, by the time they check back in at the second time point, even at a fairly similar body weight and BMI level, they will have kind of transitioned to metabolically unhealthy obesity at that point. So, with obesity, some of the mechanisms by which obesity drives chronic disease risk, they are things that are kind of cumulative over time. And so just because you recently crossed over a threshold and kind of went from a BMI of 29 to 30.3, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you get measured that day, it's going to be a completely comprehensive assessment of your long-term chronic disease risk and say, oh, hey, yeah, you now are in that obese category based on BMI, but you have not yet experienced, clinically relevant elevations in blood pressure, lipids, all the other stuff. That doesn't mean that you dodged a bullet and that's just never going to happen, right? It just means at this point in time, your metabolic health markers don't seem to be reflective of a meaningfully elevated chronic disease risk. But that doesn't eliminate the possibility that those markers could continue to trend in that direction and eventually cross over into some of those thresholds. So there's certainly much more in this paper, but those were kind of the initial main findings. And just to kind of wrap that up and put a bow on it, like I said, there are plenty of folks in the normal BMI category who do have components of metabolic syndrome. There are plenty of folks in the obese category who do not have any components of metabolic syndrome, but in general, the prevalence of those metabolic syndrome components, it does scale linearly with BMI. The higher the BMI, the greater likelihood that you have one or more components of metabolic syndrome. And then as BMI starts to, metabolically healthy obesity is not highly prevalent, at least in this sample, it was about 7.5%. But as BMI starts going up into the mid-high 30s, into the 40s and beyond, the prevalence of metabolically healthy obesity drops quite a lot. So it's a study that kind of supports arguments on both sides of this BMI debate, where some folks say, hey, you can't just look at me and perfectly predict my health status. This paper does offer some data that support that concept. But folks who say like, yeah, but, if you have a BMI of, if your BMI is in the high 30s, low 40s, I can probably make some educated guesses about, your cardiometabolic health risks long term. There's also evidence in this paper that would support that position as well. So in my discussion of the paper, I kind of talked through like, what do you do with BMI? How do you discuss it with clients or patients if you work with individuals? And, Yeah, it was kind of just a sprawling discussion, one-way discussion, since it was an article, of what do we do with BMI? How do we use it? And ultimately, my position is, as you probably found or have probably inferred, kind of in the middle. Not a particularly extreme approach. I think there is utility, but it's a very imperfect measure.
I just to commentate on just the value of the article as a whole from a kind of a sociological lens, I think this is really important work. For society to improve and for what we do in medicine to improve and for research to serve a useful purpose, I think we have to view it as the tool that we bring to the table once change is needed. Because the tools of societal change are very different than the tools of science. So advocacy, social justice, social change, whatever angle you take or generation you're from, it is largely about educating people upon a perceived problem. And I don't say perceived just because I'm like, it's all just, virtue signaling. I'm saying that, there's a lot of advocacy for a lot of different things, and there are real problems in society, and there are people advocating for those things. And their job, for their given cause is to generate awareness, educate people on what they see that problem to be, but educate them, quote unquote, in a manner of prompting change. So when PETA will inform you about the way animals are treated, it is not let me make sure I'm doing this in the most objective way possible in all contexts. It is to motivate change. And if you think back to, I remember my childhood, people dumping blood on those wearing, a mink coat or a fur coat, that prompts a visceral response. You are generating awareness, outrage, and for the people it really does connect with, hopefully behavior change. And I'm not here to discuss the merits of shame or outrage or demonstrations or what's the best way to prompt social change, because I don't know. But I know definitely that the tools that advocacy uses are different. They have different motivational, like the goals are different. The goal is to convince and not necessarily purely based upon facts. They're emotive issues. They are things that have often personally affected the people who are doing that advocacy. They affect their lives. They affect their loved ones' lives. They affect the social group they're from. So issues of race, class, health status, SES, all this stuff are heavily charged, and they should be. And the people involved in it are going to be advocating for it. And advocates are not the same thing as someone who is trying to clarify points. And I think for things that we do want to change in society, you need both. But what tends to happen when you emotionally charge people, we know this. Humans who are highly emotive, especially in a group, we have poor decision-making abilities. We have poor critical thinking. And I think there needs to be a point where people step in and then write about this from an objective standpoint, a compassionate objective standpoint, saying, okay, we've identified a problem. There's motivation to change. There is issues with that. But instead of the kind of knee-jerk reaction that most social change prompts of this is a huge issue, let's cancel it, let's destroy it, let's get rid of it, let's change it, or let's, fully do on Viva la Revolution type approach to it, we have to look at it and go, all right, now it's time to investigate this and figure out what do we do. And I think if you look at the history of political change, there are different people involved in advocacy, and then the people who are policymakers, if we look at things, who step in and make differences. And I think the role of science, especially in something like health science, is very important for us to go, okay, there is now an appetite and an awareness for change. So let's objectively evaluate what we have, what are the issues, and what do we know and what do we not know. And hopefully there can be a synergy between those two. And what concerns me sometimes in modern society is that science gets used, like you said, to prove a position. Oh, I got science on my side. And you'll see that on both, ends of the political spectrum. And I would be much more happy, not that I think it's going to happen, if in society once we got to a point where there was the social capital behind a change, that we then looked to science and went, okay, what does that look like? And in an ideal world, policymakers in all these different areas are leaning on science once they become aware of something. And I think your article is a great example of acknowledging the issues and then saying, well, what is true? and still respecting the humanity of people, and what do we do moving forward? And it's a hard line to walk. And sometimes I don't even want to touch articles like that, because you can very easily be perceived as someone who has a position on either side, or used even when you don't have a certain position to further an agenda on either side. So kudos to you on a good article, great discussion, and for kind of having those nuanced topics. And that's why, Omar, I like having this Trexler, this other Eric, on with me, because he does a great job of that.
That was the bridge.
You're far too kind, Helms. But yeah, I think it's interesting with this topic, because I have to like state this to make sure that my perspective isn't misinterpreted, because it's a touchy topic. And so like, when I wrote this article and when I speak about it, I don't want to diminish the legitimate complaints about BMI as a metric, because it is a flawed metric. I mean, objectively speaking, it doesn't account for muscle mass, and in the lifting community, that kind of matters, right? Like the most lifters don't take their BMI very seriously, because they're like, well, I have way more muscle than the average person, so I automatically know that my BMI is kind of on a sliding scale if I'm trying to use it to make inferences about my adiposity. So
By the
there's,
way, congratulations to me. I just passed under in the last few weeks the overweight category. So,
oh wow, that's fantastic.
I did it.
Yeah. Do you feel healthier?
No, I feel terrible.
You still look
I am
overweight.
no longer overweight.
Eric. I didn't want to say it.
Exactly.
You still look overweight.
I'm not there. No, objectively, I'm not. I'm like 24.
Eric, I thought, just real quick, Trex, I thought our moment of the blood on the mink's coat would have been Eric once again. So in my head, he's in his thong, okay? He's in his spandex. And he sits down and he says, does this look metabolically unhealthy to you? And he's just posing.
Yeah.
And that's the shock factor of raising awareness. And it's not what I want, and it's not just what the people want. It's what society needs. Trex, continue.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think there are really good, really valid criticisms of BMI. It has limitations. And like I said, there are documented instances in the literature where weight bias has a tangibly and objectively negative impact on healthcare and the lives of the people receiving that healthcare. But I also don't want to paint physicians with too broad a brush. So in my article, I shared an anecdote about a very the opposite experience that kind of happened with me at a physician's visit. So I went to the doctor for the first time in a very long time. And they did a physical, and the doctor asked me, "Are you concerned about your weight?" And I kind of was thinking about the question. Like, I don't know. I was like, am I concerned about it? I don't know. I'm thinking about it and just thinking about my overall health status and fitness status, and like, should I check my lipids? I haven't checked them in a while. And my physician said, before I could answer, I'm not worried about it. But my BMI was in the overweight category for sure, and so it was an instance where my healthcare professional, and like I wasn't like, wearing, a sleeveless shirt and all, like, I would not have appeared to be a particularly muscular person based on what I was wearing, but it was a medical professional who was just saying, BMI, we use it to kind of, maybe flag an instance where we might want to explore deeper and look into cardiometabolic health. But based on the information I've obtained from this person throughout this visit, I'm not worried about their overweight BMI. So it was kind of the inverse of what you would expect, where people often say, oh, doctors, they see a number over 25 and they say, you're sick, get back to me when you care about your health. And there's a lot of really great doctors who are not operating that way. But Helms, like you said, there's also the instance of all those different forms of bias. And so would I have gotten that same treatment if I wasn't at a really, I live between like 3 incredible hospitals. It's a generally affluent area where, there's great medical training. There's all those different socioeconomic and racial factors that go into it. And I walked out of that visit saying, I was impressed with how the physician handled that. I hope that other folks in different, situations would get that same treatment, but based on the literature, I'm not so sure,
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot that goes into this topic, but one thing that I also want to mention is like, folks who are more on the evidence-based fitness side, they kind of take that approach and say, hey, there's rigorous science backing up BMI as a predictive measure as it pertains to chronic disease risk. And I also want to be very candid that that's correct. There are a number of very rigorous studies demonstrating relationships between BMI and a variety of chronic disease outcomes and mortality outcomes. And so that is also a true thing that has to be acknowledged. When you want to be compassionate about the shortcomings and misuses of BMI and how that can tangibly negatively impact people, you also want to look at the evidence and say, well, despite those negative applications of BMI, I'm not going to ignore this data suggesting that we have a easy to calculate index that can give us some information to help us flag potential health risks so that we can explore with more relevant measures, right? So the idea is not that you see a BMI of 34 and you say this person's sick. You see a BMI of 34 and you say, let's explore that more. How muscular are they? What's their blood pressure like? What are their blood lipids like? HbA1c, glucose. Let's start looking into metrics that are more directly related to the chronic disease risks that we're worried about. But one additional wrinkle I want to throw into the mix here is that a lot of folks kind of oversimplify it. And they say, if you have a high BMI, you're sick. And like we've seen, the prevalence of metabolically healthy obesity is not high, but it's not zero. So that alone is a little bit off base. But people say, hey, your BMI is above 30, you need to lose weight. And then once you do, you're good. And so that's another massive flaw, not with BMI, but with how it's often applied, is that when BMI is used as the indicator, we then say, now we're shooting for a BMI target versus shooting for actual tangible health outcomes. So people say, well, let's get it. If our BMI is 31, let's get it to 24.9. And so the BMI becomes the goal, not the little warning sign out there. And there are many reasons that that's problematic. Number one, if you look at figure 3 in the article that I made, this was something that actually surprised me very much. It was from a study by Shu and colleagues in 2018. They were looking at mortality rates in people in different BMI categories. So normal weight, overweight, obese 1, and obese 2. And obese class 1 is 30 to 35, obese 2 is 35 to 40. And so unsurprisingly, they found what you would expect in terms of, as your obesity category went up and up and up, mortality increased, risk of mortality. So nothing surprising there. But the thing that jumped out to me was they did an additional analysis, and they didn't just say, okay, we're not just going to look at what your BMI is at this particular point in time. We're going to ask you about your weight history. And we want to know the highest BMI that you've ever reached in your life. And what they found was, even in the group of folks who were normal weight at their baseline measurement, and basically what they did was they took a baseline BMI measurement and then followed up for a number of years and got mortality rates based on actual deaths that were occurring in that time frame. But they said, okay, we know that at baseline you were in the normal BMI category, but what if you had lost weight to get into it, right? So they actually asked them, what's the highest BMI you've ever achieved in your entire life? And I think they also had some retrospective objective data, medical records that they could check as well. But basically what they found was the mortality rate was lowest in people who had never exceeded a BMI of 25. And it was meaningfully higher in people who had at one point an overweight BMI and then got down to normal weight when these measurements were taken. And it was yet even higher, meaningfully higher, for people who had been obese based on their BMI, had a BMI over 30, and then had gotten all the way down to the kind of normal weight category. And so that tells us a couple things. First of all, just getting your BMI back into that range is not a cure-all, right? So we need to be careful about making the BMI the target rather than the kind of warning sign indicator that says, hey, we need to have some type of health-promoting intervention potentially once we do some additional testing, right? So when BMI becomes the target, these data would suggest that that's not enough. We actually have to look at tangible health markers that are more pertinent to these chronic disease outcomes. And so that's one major thing I wanted to bring attention to in this article, which is that just because your BMI is drifting into a higher category, even if you get it down, that doesn't necessarily mean, oh, cool, all of that, potential risk is alleviated. What you probably ought to be doing is actually focusing on, am I doing the types of lifestyle interventions that actually change my glycemic control, my blood pressure? Am I reaching higher levels of physical activity on a regular basis? Am I eating a more health-promoting diet? So you want to make sure that you're actually focusing on health outcomes, not just, I want to get into a particular BMI range. So that's critically important. But then another wrinkle I want to throw in here is, and this is where we kind of lean a little bit more toward that compassionate side of this, debate, so to speak. The reality is, a lot of folks who attempt to, let's say your BMI is 32, a lot of folks who attempt to get their BMI below 25, it's not going to happen. And you could talk all day about the best methods for getting there and what are the major barriers and challenges that prevent someone from getting there, but just tangibly, objectively looking at the data, there aren't that many folks who are going to really successfully drop their BMI by 12 points and maintain it in the long term. I mean, we have all the data in the world suggesting that is a very, very, very challenging thing to do. Mm-hmm. Now, the new classes of weight loss drugs are making that look more feasible than ever, which is a really exciting thing to me. But the reality is, one of the criticisms about BMI is, and I think folks have a pretty fair point here, is you're telling me that my BMI is high and I should lose weight. But weight loss trials have very, very poor success rates. And so if you were to treat weight loss the way you would treat any other medical intervention, you would say, this intervention kind of sucks. It's like, I'm not saying it doesn't work.
And it's also not homogenous. The just to help the reader out, the listener out, I would definitely encourage you to check back to some of the episodes we've had with Gabrielle Fundaro, as well as Dr. Ben House, who also wrote a guest article on this topic for Mass. And he went over some of the trials that have had the highest success rates for long-term weight loss maintenance. And right at the definition, we can see that it is different than what we think of colloquially. It's not someone going from a 36 BMI to under 25, going from quote-unquote class 2 obesity to quote-unquote normal. We all immediately move the bar to 5 or up to 10% weight loss that is maintained for more than a year. That in the literature is what we define as successful weight loss maintenance. And if you really think about what type of change that is, that's probably sufficient to move you one BMI category in most cases. And there is notably significant improvements in metabolic health when you do that on average. So it is relevant, but it's a very different story. And with that very much lower bar than what we think of on Instagram, we see the before and after of someone who used to have class 2 obesity and now they're normal. That only has a 50%-ish success rate when you have a team of psychologists, dietitians, registered nurses, and clinicians who are using the most up-to-date, best practices we can think of in a combined multidisciplinary team that is typically not accessible except to people with the highest SES, and is definitely not the standard care that we have in any developed nation, even, unfortunately. So if you are having graduate level care for over multiple years, you got a 50-50 shot at being able to have, a 5 to 10% weight loss that you maintain long term. And that's not, and again, how do you interpret this? Well, it definitely pushes back against the whole weight loss is impossible and diet only harms people, and that is a negative intervention. But it's not a home run by any means. It's a flip of a coin. It's a roll of the die. And I think this is a really important conversation to have. And you're doing a great job, bang up job, Eric, on talking about it. And this will connect very nicely to those other episodes.
Well, I appreciate that, Helms. But yeah, I think one of the things that I tried to really stress in this article, I don't want to give the impression that weight loss is impossible. It's not. I don't want to give the impression that weight loss should not be pursued if you have an elevated BMI. I do think that's a good idea. But I think if you frame the success of your intervention as, I'm either going to get to a BMI of 24.9 or I'm going to fail, that's tough because a lot of people are going to fail, especially if you're starting with a BMI that's significantly beyond 30. I mean, going from 30 to 25 is a serious accomplishment, right? And so I think the data that I referenced previously also says just getting to a BMI of 25 doesn't mean that you've erased all the chronic disease risk elevation, right? So it's not a totally sufficient intervention to eliminate that prior risk. And it's also not a particularly feasible intervention just looking at the numbers in terms of pure success rate. So when I said weight loss, kind of sucks as an intervention, it's not that it doesn't work and it's not that it's impossible, but it's like, I'm just saying strictly from like, if you zoom out and look at it like any other treatment, like let's say there's a medication, a pill on the market, and for some reason, everyone prescribed to this pill, they just refuse to take it. They don't like how it makes them feel. That pill might actually do the thing it's supposed to do. It might treat the condition it's supposed to treat. But if no one's taking it, it's not an effective treatment. It gets down to that difference between effectiveness and efficacy, where, one is like, does it work, strictly speaking? And the other is like, but when you give this to a patient, does it actually help them get better, right? Like in the real world. So that's where things like adherence and compliance come into the mix. So the thing with weight loss is, it's a really nice part of an intervention that you would pursue if you notice that, I have elevated BMI, I have several components of metabolic syndrome, I need to get my cardiometabolic health back on track. Weight loss would ideally be a part of that and would be an important part of that. However, we really can't act like that's the only thing you got to do, because there's other components of health that you have to address if you're in a state of poor cardiometabolic health. And we also have to leave an avenue open, I think, where we can feel like, not just feel like, but we need to have an avenue where we can say, hey, we objectively improved cardiometabolic health markers, but we didn't achieve a massive weight loss. And so in my article, I talked about where, some of the folks who really focus on BMI, I think need to be a little bit more open to embracing weight neutral interventions for folks who have elevated BMI plus a variety of, cardiometabolic perturbations or metabolic syndrome components. So the way that I try to frame it when I'm, talking to someone who's in this position or talking about this set of circumstances is, there's an individual with elevated BMI, maybe they're in the obese category, and they have, impaired glycemic control, their blood lipids are very poor, their diet quality is low, their physical activity level is low. If that person keeps the exact same weight and the exact same BMI, but they are, exercising more, they're on a very thoughtful exercise program or physical activity program, they start improving their diet quality, they start getting really serious about, having a good sleep schedule. If you focus on some of these behavioral things that are much more feasible in the short term than just saying, over the next 6 months, I'm going to lose 10% of my body weight or something like that, what you can often find is that a person loses no weight, keeps the same exact BMI, but has very tangible improvements in a lot of their cardiometabolic health markers. And so you might find that someone, forget about the exact cutoffs, you might find someone who maybe they still technically have 2 or 3 metabolic syndrome components, but I'm telling you, like a total cholesterol of 330 is not the same as 201, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a fasting blood glucose of 140 isn't the same as 101 or whatever the cutoffs are. Like, you could dramatically chip away at the severity of some of these cardiometabolic risk factors without weight loss necessarily being part of it. And so I think it's really important when you have an intervention with a very low success rate, there have to be ways to win and have success and actually focus on some of those other markers and not have the whole thing be about weight loss. And I think, Helms, getting back to what you're talking about with people who advocate, do a lot of advocacy work, I think a lot of folks who are critical of BMI, that's really what is at the root of their argument, but they're not formulating it in a way that is, in many cases, scientifically defensible. Sometimes they don't add all the nuance that makes it align really well with the literature or the physiological basis. But there is a little seed of truth in there, which is that, some folks will say, oh, they shouldn't be doing weight loss because reason X, Y, and Z. I wouldn't go that far, but I would say weight loss should be part of the approach, ideally, but it can't be the whole approach, and it shouldn't be the whole approach. You should be focusing, if metabolic syndrome is present, regardless of BMI, you should be focusing on a variety of other behaviors that are not just losing weight. And if you have metabolic syndrome plus elevated adiposity or high BMI, great. If we can make weight loss part of that and succeed in that, that's going to be an objectively positive thing. But it's not the only way to intervene and address that cardiometabolic health impairment.
Well, Trex, I think you said that very well. And if I may, just to kind of bolster your point, if anyone was tracking with you and agreeing with you on your earlier point that BMI might be used as an early warning sign, not an actual diagnostic criteria, but an indicator to do further testing, actual direct testing of health, not just looking at a marker for health, a proxy, if you will, then that's just a consistent philosophical carry-through to what does treatment mean, right? So if we're looking at an indicator, we're not trying to change a proxy. We're trying to change what that proxy is a proxy for, which is health. And it also perfectly connects with what we understand about behavioral science, that when we purely focus on an outcome or we focus on goals instead of the process, that we see higher recidivism, right? I've talked about a number of studies on iron culture through the years where when you are focused purely on goals, it can actually detract from the likelihood of reaching them. There's the study that I reviewed in mass on people who successfully attain their New Year's resolutions, and how when you did all these different steps, eventually you saw a drop-off when you added SMART goals, because SMART goals often operationalize and make you focus on outcomes rather than processes. So if BMI or weight loss is just something that occurs or is related to health, okay, well, we should be focused on health behaviors, right? Let's eat more fruits and vegetables. Let's teach you how to cook. Let's get a consistent schedule. Let's get social support. Let's get regular physical activity. Let's find exercise that you enjoy. And the more wins we can tick in that column, it might increase the probability that we could see a change in your BMI or weight loss. But that's not the goal. The goal is actually those health markers, like you said. So I don't think you can actually agree with anything that Trexler said at the start of this, where you're like, okay, yeah, BMI is a pretty good predictor, but you're right, it's not health. And then turn around and then disagree and say, no, but we need to see that weight loss. It's like, well, hey, that will probably be associated with people who have larger changes, but ultimately it is an association, it's a correlation. And sure, if we want to get into the physiology, there is some issues with adipose tissue in high amounts and inflammation, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately what we're looking at and what is most successful from a behavioral standpoint is people adopting lifestyle changes that are healthy.
Yeah.
And great if that results in weight loss. But I can tell you with high confidence that just being more active and eating a healthier diet and getting more sleep, being more mindful, and focusing on these processes and ingraining them in your lifestyle will have objective improvements in the vast majority of people's health markers. And I think that's very hard to refute. And there are actually data looking at metabolically healthy obesity, where it co-varies with, say, higher VO2 max in people with obesity. So when you start to look at this in another way, like, okay, if we look at fitness scores among people with obesity, you see a higher prevalence of metabolically healthy obesity. So it's not super high, and I'm not going to say it totally changes the percentages that Trex has, and there are issues with some of that data as well. But ultimately, I think that there should be a pursuit of these behaviors independent of whether or not they result in a change in a proxy measure, for the same reason that it is a proxy measure for us to then go, right, high BMI, maybe we should do some blood work.
Yeah. I mean, I know that some folks might be listening to this and saying, yeah, I get all that. You've been talking for an hour. But like, if I look at someone and they have a BMI of 47, I don't think that is quote unquote healthy. And what they really mean by that is, I suspect with a high level of confidence that they have probably several components of metabolic syndrome. And you know what? They're probably correct, right? Now, I hope you don't use that as an opportunity to throw a fit just because they're on a cover of a magazine and they have a high BMI, because that's always when these conversations come up. And it's like, you don't care about that person's health. You're just posting about how you don't think they should be on a magazine because they have a high BMI. So I hope you won't do that in the future. But anyway, when when someone makes that statement and says, well, BMI of 47, that doesn't seem to be conducive to optimal cardiometabolic health. That's true, right? And also, I'll acknowledge for someone who has elevated BMI and, several components of metabolic syndrome, I would say the ideal best case scenario would be that they lose weight, they get down to a low BMI category, and they're doing all those other health behaviors that you mentioned. But I think the core of the argument, not that I even have an argument, I'm just kind of saying, hey, here's what we can do with this, here's what we can't, here's what the data say. But I think the core of the argument that a lot of folks make, and that I think has I think it's a credible argument to make, is if you have, obesity plus metabolic syndrome, if you're not going to be able to feasibly lose all the weight and improve all those health markers, perhaps metabolically healthy obesity at a BMI in the low 30s is actually kind of a useful thing to shoot for, right? So when we look at the success rates of getting down to 22 and having, all of your health markers across the board back into, the standard reference ranges, that's a low probability for a lot of folks, especially if they're starting out, really far away from that 25 BMI category. So I think that, like you said, we just have to be really cautious about not making the proxy somehow turn into the goal. And I think, I will acknowledge that weight loss plus all those behaviors is generally an ideal approach. But if we're being objective about the data, we know that for a lot of folks, that tremendous amount of weight loss is probably not going to happen. And we shouldn't discourage people from pursuing all those other health behaviors in a totally weight neutral manner. So I know folks will be listening and saying, that this conversation generally has highlighted a lot of the points that are critical of BMI and the way it's applied. But I do want to acknowledge, no, there's useful applications of BMI. It's not useless. It's a really nuanced topic where you have to be very mindful of what exactly are we measuring? What does that truly tell us? And then based on those things, what interventions are warranted based on the circumstances, right? And so I would say, one scenario I haven't really addressed, what if your BMI is 31 and you are, you go to the doctor, you get everything checked out, and you're considered metabolically healthy with obesity, right? What do you do there? Well, I would say, okay, that's probably an indicator that you're still in a good spot here, where you haven't seen this kind of cumulative impact that leads to elevations in blood pressure, blood lipids, glucose, alterations in glycemic control, things like that. Perhaps this is a really opportune intervention point where you say, okay, what is my likelihood of getting down from 31 to something in the mid-20s? I'm not going to make 25 this kind of magic cutoff, but what are the chances that I'm still in a good enough position here? I can lose 3 BMI points and, maybe really get more intentional about being more active and having a more health conducive or health compatible diet. I think that that's a perfectly justifiable application of BMI, of saying, hey, I'm glad that I, had this BMI flagged and I got these tests done and it doesn't look like I have, various components of metabolic syndrome. This is a great time to be proactive about this, maybe get a little bit leaner, not focus exactly on 25 being a magic threshold, but this is a great time to be proactive about this and get ahead of this and hopefully, change some health behaviors, maybe lose a little weight, maybe not, but just get really intentional about making sure that I'm managing my chronic disease risk as I see that my BMI is kind of creeping into that obese category.
I think that's a great message. And you're speaking basically directly to the people who might have that higher BMI. And I think when I think about the Iron Culture listeners, there's plenty of people who might. And there's probably a ton of personal trainers and people who'd be on the I'll say clinical side, but maybe that's, I don't mean doctors. I think there's probably fewer doctors and fewer health scientists listening to Iron Culture than personal trainers and people who help people with their nutrition. So one thing to look at this as well is, even if you are kind of resistant to some of the message being said here, ultimately it comes down to, for you, the practitioner, what do you do when you've got someone in one of these categories or scenarios, I should say? And ultimately, I still think if you're not convinced and you think the goal is to get them to lose weight and that's going to be the best thing, if that's the best outcome, regardless of likelihood, and you're stuck on that, the best approach is not to have them focus a ton on weight loss. It's to adopt behaviors. That is ultimately, and then that's a heavily evidence-based position. Your goal is to help them make the changes, make the process-oriented goals of changing their lifestyle. You want to get them drinking more fluids. You want to get them on a regular schedule. You want to get them eating more fruits and vegetables, right? You want to get them eating more lean proteins, basically changing their lifestyle, not focused on, and did that result in the scale going down each time you step in, regardless of what your personal training manager says, or regardless of what you think your Instagram transformation needs to look like to get people in the door and pay you money. If you actually care about outcomes, and I think you probably do as a practitioner listening to Iron Culture, the most effective approach, just what do you do, regardless of where you agree or disagree with the data or its interpretation, is get people to focus on process-oriented goals and what they do on a day-to-day basis, not just the outcome. And that will go hand in hand with this, regardless of if you agree or disagree, right? Because even if there is not weight loss, those things will be positives, neutral at worst, right? So I think it all is a relatively straightforward thing when it comes down to being pragmatic about it, in my opinion. So yeah.
Yeah, that's why I feel like I have nowhere to kind of plant my stake in the ground. I was like, my argument, and then I was like, I don't really have an argument. I'm just like, there's all these different arguments floating around about BMI, and you just kind of try to hold that and kind of look at the evidence and say, okay, does it support that? Does it not? And in most cases, it's a mixed bag, right? Like how many times throughout this podcast did I say, yeah, this study kind of supports that side and kind of supports the other side a little bit too, depending on how you look at it. So this is a nuanced topic, and I think the more that we can embrace that, and like you said, Helms, focus on being pragmatic. We see that the small debates that still rage on about this are not particularly actionable. Like when it comes to, some of the little quibbles over the details don't actually change the plan, which is that when you observe an elevated BMI, how do you then intervene and what is the plan? It might shift, how you frame valuing this outcome versus that outcome, but the path you're taking ultimately stays pretty much the same. And the way that I put it in the article is basically, if you can reduce your BMI and maintain it from an elevated level, then that's fantastic. And the research we have suggested that would be a positive thing for your health. But the research would also suggest that's easier said than done. And with that in mind, weight reduction can be part of the plan, but you'll also want to make sure that there are some totally weight neutral health behaviors that you're focusing on so that you can make meaningful strides, even if it happens to be in the absence of weight loss. And then the one final thing I would mention on this topic is if we're going to treat BMI as kind of just a little indicator, like it's kind of like the, hey, check engine light. It's like your engine might be fine. It could be that the light's malfunctioning or it's just something very, very minor, right? But it's just that thing that says, hey, BMI's into a new category now, or it's creeping up a little bit. Might be something to look into, right? I think another point that I haven't made that is really important is BMI can be a nice thing to keep an eye on in terms of just trajectory over time, and specifically with regards to prevention. And so I think that that's really a critical element of that data I discussed, indicating that it's not just your BMI when you say, okay, this is now my BMI, measure me, right? That's not really indicative of your cumulative lifetime chronic disease risk. And there was that study where the folks who had never exceeded a normal weight had a very different long-term risk than folks who had gotten into the overweight or obese categories and then lost that weight later in life. And so I think BMI, even if you're someone who's listening to this and you're fairly lean, it's not necessarily a terrible idea, whether you're focusing on BMI or body weight or how your clothes feel. I think prevention is often overlooked when it comes to adiposity. And keeping an eye on trajectories, and just when you notice, hey, I've noticed that like year over year, I've kind of moved up my waist size on my pants, and it's kind of forming a bit of a trajectory that I'm not thrilled about. BMI could be part of that type of trajectory tracking where you start to say, okay, let me go ahead and intervene as a preventative mechanism or intervention rather than letting my BMI get up to a dramatically elevated place and then saying, fine, now I'm going to, lose weight after having, chronic year-over-year BMI elevations or weight elevations. So I think even if right now BMI is not top of mind, having some metric that works for you for kind of keeping an eye on your adiposity, just to make sure that it doesn't kind of sneak up on you, track up over time. I think with obesity, if you talk to obesity researchers right now, there seems to be a big shift toward two things. First of all, the weight loss drugs, which are pretty incredible so far based on what we've seen. But number two, there's so much more emphasis on prevention because it's so much easier to prevent obesity than to treat obesity. And if you work in the health and fitness space, that is something that I think is really useful to keep in mind.
Insightful, practical, and perhaps most importantly, compassionate. I mean, we blew our budget, gents, about an hour ago when we queued. It's a monster episode, so we got nothing left. But just to reemphasize it, someone famously, Trex, said in a previous episode, and it has since become an iron culturism, identifying a problem is not the same as providing a solution. And I genuinely just wish, because sometimes you have these shouting matches on social media, that some of the people, we mentioned personal trainers with some of the loudest voices, were in their head. It's a neat little paradigm that, if one simply, what's a truism, works harder, you eat a little less, you'll get the desired outcome. And if they understand that their personal experiences are necessarily translatable over to other people, and it doesn't scale up the fact that you're a personal trainer and you had 10 pounds of weight to lose, and now you're talking to somebody with a higher BMI, and you're not understanding why they just can't do it, in quotations, without any empathy, compassion, or understanding of it. It's tough, man. Like we were talking also, Trex, maybe I know we want to wrap this up, but like heritability, like genetics, and like you're mentioning a family, like I said with myself, where we all assume we have these like same immutable characteristics that we're also starting with. They're like, oh, like, wait a second, I could go ahead and do this and no problem. For me, it's not going to be tough when I attempt to do this intervention, like so on and so forth. I want to lose. I just can't understand it because I'm not in that position. And I think I'm not sure, Helms, who we had first. Either shout out to both Dr. Gabrielle Fandaro and Mr. Dr. Ben House. But I loved all the conversations where it was led once again with compassion. So with the patient in mind or the person, rather than someone feeling good about themselves or trying to solve a problem without having any understanding of the intricacies. And I just loved this episode. This was I knew it was going to be good. Like at Trex, I would highly recommend anyone to obviously be a subscriber to Mass. Link is down below. Shout out to Kai to check it out. But man, I think this shows to me personally why the addition of Trex, the combination of you two on this episode, is just amazing. Yeah, and I'm saying that as someone who obviously listened to it and someone I think it's a very important topic. I think you guys crushed it.
And Omar, I know you've been giving up the spotlight a lot this episode, but I think that was a really important addition that you made to just remind folks that
eat less.
When you're thinking, yeah, exactly. When you're thinking like, why can't you just do the thing that I did? Just thinking of different circumstances. So like I mentioned with my visit to the physician's office, as I was walking out, I was like, I wonder if it goes that way for everybody based on all those different demographic variables. And even if it was me, but in a different healthcare setting, would I have received that type of care? And it's a lot like, I think that's what's pretty amazing about the weight loss drugs that are getting more popular is that when you talk to folks who are using them, it's almost like talking to someone, Omar, as you rub your eyes, the first time you wear glasses. Like I got glasses as a child, and I remember saying, whoa, you guys have been seeing like this?
Yep.
I had no idea. I didn't know you were supposed to see individual leaves on the trees, right? Or when someone who's had chronic depression and anxiety gets on an effective medication and responds well to it, and they say, you wake up and feel like this every day? I had no idea. Like it's been really illuminating to talk to people who are using some of these this new class of weight loss drugs, and they're saying the way that I think about food, the way that my appetite is regulated, I actually feel the way that other people feel when I sit down at a table and eat. Like I'm not thinking about food all day, and I don't come to every meal with this ravenous appetite. Like, I don't know. It's just, until you've experienced something like that, it can be hard to really wrap your head around the fact that there are people in your life who experience everything throughout the day fundamentally differently than you do because of a heritable or kind of chronically developing difference. And it's like, you don't really recognize how prevalent that is until you've been the person who throws on the pair of glasses and says, wait, you guys have been seeing like this?
Yep.
And so like, yeah, I think it's just important not to assume that everyone's experience with appetite, hunger, weight loss, physical activity is exactly like yours, because there are so many instances where, if you were able to experience it the way they do, you'd say, whoa, this is a very different set of circumstances. So, yeah, I think that's a good thing to end on, is just reminding people that, like, take a second, take a deep breath, zoom out and ask yourself, is it possible that my experience with this is just fundamentally different than someone else's? And in many cases, the answer is going to be yes.
Well said. I got nothing to add to that. That's a fantastic note to end on.
Whew. It's a monster episode. Fireworks, fireworks, fireworks. I want to thank my fellow co-hosts for being on. Link to all their social media as well as Mass will be linked in the description down below. I want to thank every single Iron Culture listener for tuning in to another episode of The Iron Culture. You can go ahead and leave a rating and review. Typically, people will give 5 stars. We leave it to your own discretion. We're not encouraging groupthink. We're just letting you know what the best, most informed people will leave. So it's up to you to figure out whether or not you concur with them, or if you have a divergent opinion. And if you do, maybe you should question yourself, why is it divergent? Nonetheless, 5 stars is that rating. We're back every single insert date here from now until the end of time. We'll catch you in that next episode.